And one of the things that has become increasingly apparent, and especially I think that's true in this century, is that even very high-level functions like reasoning or personality traits or certain aspects of decision-making and choice depend on the brain. And that when there are changes in the brain in certain particular regions, we see personality changes, or we see the inability to do things like recognize familiar faces, or the inability to name certain categories of animals, even though you can still name categories of tools. So the increasing mind-brain dependency, or the mental state dependency, has suggested that the mind probably is nothing other than the product of brain activity. The other thing, of course, is biological evolution. Next slide, please. And I want to say just a little bit first about this slide before I move on to biological evolution. This is a slide of a living human. This is taken in the Damasio lab in Iowa City. This is a subject who had a tumor in the ventral frontal medial region, and I'll say a bit more about his capacities later. But this is in the frontal region here. This is looking at the brain from the underside, and you can see that if you think of the area sort of above the orbits of the eyes, you can see a tremendous amount of damage there. This is someone who had very high IQ, both before and after the damage. Before the damage, he was very responsible, very reserved, socially very appropriate. After the damage, it was surgery to remove a tumor. After the damage, he was very irresponsible, very boisterous, raucous, and socially very inappropriate, but otherwise, in just about all respects, very normal. Next slide, please. So biological evolution is the other sort of huge, major reason why it seems as though there is just the physical brain. In Descartes' conception of things, humans only had a soul, and that was by virtue of an intervention of a divine kind. But we know now, of course, that our brains are tremendously similar to the brains of other animals, and in particular to the brains of primates. We also know that our genes are tremendously similar to the genes of other primates, but to other animals, other mammals in particular, in general. In this slide, it's hard not to imagine that he has similar capacities to what we have. This is a chimpanzee from the Pavanelli lab who, for the first time, is looking in a mirror. In the experiment, the chimpanzee comes into a room, sees a mirror for the first time, and not surprisingly regards the image in the mirror as another chimpanzee and makes various threatening gestures to it and so forth, and is puzzled. After a few moments, and the time is surprisingly short, he realizes something isn't right. And so he begins just to make random movements. And he realizes, or one says, you see him puzzled, and over the course of a few seconds, he understands that everything that he does, the image does. And suddenly he realizes it's him. So he goes forward into the mirror, and he smiles, and he looks at his teeth, and he begins to pick his teeth. And here you see him looking into his eye, seeing his own eye for the very first time. The continuities between our brain and the brain of primates and the brain of chimpanzees suggests that however it is that we engage in intelligent behavior, recognize ourselves in mirrors, have a concept of ourselves as a self, is owed in some way that we don't really yet understand, but is owed fundamentally to the brain. Next slide, please. Even animals that are very different from us, or at least on the surface, seem to be very different, do things that are surprisingly intelligent. And this is just one of my favorite stories, so I had to include it. This was work done by an ethologist called Bernd Heinrich. And what he was interested in was the matter of problem solving, which, remember, Descartes thought could only be done by a non-physical mind. That, in his view, what animals did was essentially fixed action patterns. It was all reflex. In this experiment, Heinrich did the following thing. He had a trapeze, and from the trapeze, he tied a piece of rope. And at the end of the string, he put on a piece of meat. The birds were all hungry. And he had a population of crows and a population of ravens. And he allowed the birds in one at a time. Now, there's only one way of solving that. And that's what you have to do is get on the perch. And then, given the length of the string, you have to use your beak, pull up, step on it, pull up, step on it. And he rigged it so you had to do that at least 7 times in order to get the meat. None of the crows could do it. One by one, the crows would fly in. They would kind of look at it. They'd fly at the meat, get their necks jerked, and would be very cross. He let a raven in, and the raven comes in and sits on one of the perches and looks. This is a very hungry raven, but he knows that he's going to get his neck jerked if he just flies at it. After a period of time, and in some cases it was hours, the raven would go onto the perch and solve the problem in one trial. Now, what does that tell us? I think it tells us, amongst other things, that yes, the brain is a causal device. Yes, the brain is a piece of meat, but it's a very fancy problem solver. And there is a way that the raven solved the problem. And it may not, at a certain level, be all that different from how we solve problems. And we can talk again a bit about that later. Next slide. I think I'll just miss this one and go on to the next slide, please. So how things stand at this point seems to be this, that we have an enormous range of interesting capacities, from sensory ones to motor, to reasoning, use of language. We feel emotions, we pay attention to things, and all of those seem to be the outcome of activities in neurons in the physical brain. Now, the contemporary problem, at least as seen by some philosophers, can be stated this way. Well, okay, if that's true, can we fundamentally expect that neurobiological facts will be able to explain psychological facts? Will we be able to understand ourselves as mental creatures in terms of neurons? And I take the second statement really to be a restatement of the first. I think that those are essentially equivalent. But it's a way of phrasing it that makes contact with other sciences such as physics, where we see the reduction of the phenomenon of light to the phenomenon of electromagnetic radiation. Next slide, please. Now again, although most philosophers are naturalists or materialists in the sense that they think there is only the brain and the mind is a product of the brain, nevertheless there is a divergence that sort of mirrors the divergence in the tradition of philosophy. There are those who want to argue that no matter what you know about the physical brain, you will never be able to explain what it is to feel pain or what it is to be conscious. On the other hand, there's a second group which, for want of a better term, I call the try-and-seers, who say that you do the best you can, you get the psychological constraints from experimental psychologists that define at a behavioral level what the capacity is. You get the neurobiological constraints that help you make correlations and help you understand the substrate, and any other constraints you can get your hands on from physics or from chemistry or wherever, and you see where the science takes you.